I work in the media, of course, and they always tell you when you're doing a production, when you're staging a production, that you shouldn't hype up the production too much. You want to under-promise and over-perform, because if you say it's going to be great, then people are going to be waiting to be wowed and waiting to be dazzled. But what I'm here to do today is just to moderate an incredible discussion. So I feel no pressure whatsoever put on myself to tell you that this is going to be the best panel that you see today. This is all the pressure's on them, not me. This panel of experts understands the reality of the threat that we're facing when it comes to China. And they not only understand the reality, they have detailed, well thought out, ideologically sound prescriptions for how to protect the United States' stance as the world superpower. So that's all I'm going to say. Without further ado, let me welcome our panel. First up is President of the Government Accountability Institute, author of Clinton Cash and Red Handed, Peter Schweizer. We have former US Trade Representative, Ambassador Michael Lighthizer, Robert Lighthizer. We have Congressman from Texas, Chip Roy. And we have our resident expert on all things China, Michael Pillsbury. All right, so what I want to do today with this panel is start out with a yes or no question and go down the line, ask you each yes or no. In our lifetime, are we going to face war with China?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
I'm a politician. Not if we do the right things.
Okay, what are the right things?
Start going on offense and stop playing defense on China. Stop talking about it and do it. Right now, we're letting China own the Western Hemisphere. Why don't we have a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine? Why don't we own Latin America ourselves? Why don't we export the rule of law in the Western Hemisphere instead of allow China to own our backyard, empower cartels, endanger Americans, and actually own the economic environment in South America? We could change that instantaneously if we went on offense. It's our hemisphere. That would alone reset the stage right away. I think if we went on offense right now, we're America. There's nothing we can't do, but that's the starting place for me, is go on offense and send a loud message to the world. We're not going to let China do it.
That's not exactly the foreign policy that we've seen the last few years.
It is not.
And perhaps that's why we are where we are today. Ambassador, you say no, that we're not going to see a war with China, but the fentanyl crisis especially, you said this to me the other day, you said this alone would be justification for strategic decoupling with China. Explain what you mean.
I think we won't have a war because I'm optimistic like Rick Scott and Josh Hawley. I think that we will, and the congressman, I think we will do the right things. And to me, it's clearly the military stuff, and everyone knows that, and we know what it is, and we know how to do it, and we're slipping behind, but we know how to do it. But the most important thing is we've got to stop giving them $350 billion every year and American jobs and communities. And we need to strategically decouple. And I'm happy to talk about what that means. Anyone who understands the crisis and the challenge and the threat cannot then say we need business as usual. We cannot have business as usual. We have to change our economic relationship to China and get back to balance, no technology, and very little investment going back and forth. And if we do that, then we're going to at least get in a position where it's going to be difficult for them to wage war on us.
And Peter, we talk about this, you're often a guest on the Liz Wheeler Show, we talk about this often. There's incredible institutional resistance to what the ambassador is talking about. Speak to that, because it's nearly impossible to do this strategic decoupling when our institutions have been captured.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. You have a lot of officials in Washington that I would say essentially are for sale, or at least for rent. And China is willing to provide opportunities for their families to flourish. I would begin with the first family of the United States, but it's not a problem simply with him. It's a bipartisan problem on both sides of the issue. And there is so much money sloshing through Washington, D.C. from China or Chinese connected entities. It's a huge problem not only in government, but in the private sector. I mean, there are a lot of think tanks in Washington that take money from China, or the U.S. affiliates of China-based companies. Heritage Foundation, by one, is not Heritage has a policy of not taking that money, and they ought to be applauded for that. But it's an enormous problem. And just, you asked for a single word answer, yes or no, if we're going to be at war with China. My view is that China's already at war with us. And you can look at fentanyl. I'm doing research in this area right now. Very extensive involvement by the CCP in the fentanyl trade, which I'm researching right now. You can look at how they handled COVID, their efforts to corner the market on masks before they let the world know that it could be transferred from human to human, even though they already knew that. In my mind, and I would defer to Michael Pillsbury on this because he's the expert, their mindset is they don't want a kinetic war with the United States. To paraphrase Churchill, they want the fruits of war, they don't want war. And I think they're already engaging in that behavior.
And Michael, go right ahead, clap, go right ahead. Michael, let me ask you, when you're diagnosing this problem, which you do masterfully, you diagnose this problem as not necessarily wanting a kinetic war, but that they have this 100-year plan. From the perspective of our foreign policy, what or who is most responsible for allowing the Chinese to get this close to success with their plan?
I think part of the answer is what Senator Josh Hawley said about the global order. But it's not just the 90s. He was talking about the 1990s. The idea goes way back into the 1880s, 1890s, that somehow there needs to be a global order with a kind of a judge and a jury, and everybody follows the laws. There won't be any aggression, or if there is, it'll be punished. This dream you see a lot in the declassified conversations that Henry Kissinger had with the Chinese back in 1971. And they were very clever. They humored him. They said, yes, we just want to be one of the top 5 countries. Oh, by the way, please help us, because we'll be your friend. And I'm simplifying, but it's a over 50-year story when large percentages of the American officials who dealt with China in the 70s, 80s, and 90s became what I would call cheerleaders. And the reason I know this is I was one of them. I was on the Reagan campaign advisory group, the Reagan transition, and then worked for Reagan in the Pentagon. He sold weapons to China, Mark 46 torpedoes for the Chinese submarine fleet, artillery, a set of 7 weapon systems. Where did the idea come from? I went to see him at his home in Pacific Palisades. I just written an article in Foreign Policy magazine that the ultimate way for us and the Chinese to cooperate to bring down the Soviet Union was not just top secret intelligence sharing, but weapon sales. And Reagan, in a press conference after we met, said yes, he was in favor of that. So if you've got the greatest anti-communist conservative president of all time, Ronald Reagan, as one of the cheerleaders, you see what Peter's referring to? Deep in our government still is the notion that China is our friend. Maybe Xi Jinping shouldn't be so mean to the Uyghurs. Maybe he should rein in the fentanyl money laundering activities. But somehow the Chinese are going to come around again. And this is why I said yes about war with China. In 1950, we had very similar views about China. The UN said unify all of Korea. We went north. Top secret instructions were sent to MacArthur. You may continue into northern Korea, unify the whole country, if you don't detect any signs of Chinese presence. There were, at that point, we now know there were 300,000 Chinese soldiers inside northern Korea. We didn't know about it. And one account is they stand up in snowsuits, white snowsuits, and start killing Marines. One of the Marines is still alive. I talked to him from my next book, Bob. His name is Major Patrick Rowe. He was the young intelligence officer who first saw the Chinese stand up. And he spent the next 40 years of his life writing a book on how it happened, how we were deceived, surprised, unprepared. 30,000 Americans get killed. That's why I'm very nervous and scared about the prospects of misperception between the US and China by accident, leading to another war like Korea.
And Congressman, what's interesting, I think, as we see what Michael talks about is the battlefronts of this maybe war that China thinks that they're fighting against us is both military but also cultural. So talk to me about a piece of legislation that's been highly controversial in Congress, this bill to ban TikTok. Talk to me about the Chinese communist influence behind TikTok and the threat that poses to the American population.
Yeah, sure. Let me just add one other point, though. And you asked that first question about war. I mean, the point that China is already at war with us. I wouldn't dispute that that concept and proposition. When you said we'll be at war, that to me implies hot war. And look, there's nothing more that the people in this town would love for me and other politicians to say than, yeah, we're going to be in a hot war with China. So the defense complex in this town can start rattling up about how they need to spend more of our money and continue to ratchet up the very debt that is making us beholden to China in the first place. We have $32 trillion of debt. We're under a 22-year-old authorization of the use of military force in Iraq, which we refuse to undo. We are not actually strategically figuring out how we need to make our military strong but sparingly used, a la Reagan. It ought to be the strongest military in the world, but we should use it frigging sparingly. And we should make it so if it's used, it's decisive. But nobody in this town wants to talk about that because they would love for us to just keep throwing out billions and billions of dollars racking up debt for your kids and grandkids. And we can't do that anymore. We're at a place right now where the debt level is where it was in 1946 after World War II. So if I listen to another person come up to me and tell me it's 1939, start acting like it, well, guess what? We're not in a position to ratchet up the machine like we were in 1941 because we've spent ourselves into oblivion. So you want to beat China? Get your fiscal house in order and do it right now. And that's why we're having a fight over the debt ceiling. On TikTok, all I'll say is this. If you put a clean bill in front of me to ban TikTok, like straight up, I'm in. I don't want China to be anywhere near what they're doing to our kids right now in terms of infiltrating in social media. I'd go further. I think social media is killing our kids. I don't think our kids should even be on social media. And I know I'm a limited government federalist, but I was at the Masters last Sunday with my son where they ban iPhones, and it's the best day we've probably ever had because there was no technology. We were having conversations with people like it was 1992 again. So I'd ban TikTok, but I don't like the Mark Warner bill. I don't want to empower bureaucrats in the federal government to just go banning all manners of technology because some Democrat and bureaucrats say they know what's good for us. So if we're going to do it, Congress should own it and do it.
Don't you love a guy like this in Congress? It's a breath of fresh air. Ambassador, I want to go back to something that you said before. This phrase, your phrase, strategic decoupling. Do explain that to us, because the idea of disentangling our economy from China's is not a small proposition. It sounds good philosophically. How do we do that without destroying the American way of life?
Well, let me say, first of all, if the American way of life depends on $580 billion of imports from China, then we are doomed. Don't worry about anything else. Just go home and kiss your kids, because we're doomed, all right? So what we have now is a situation where we buy $580 billion. We sell them about $150 billion, some agriculture, some this and that. The net of that is that every year we ship them about $350 billion. And if you want to know what the real butcher's bill is, it's $350 billion on the trade deficit. It's probably another 20 or 30 billion of stuff that comes in through Vietnam. It's probably about 300 billion a year in loss of technology that they steal from us. And it's probably an unknown number, but certainly in the tens of billions in fentanyl, which they ship to Mexico as a party in power, knowing is killing our kids, right? It's not like, and you alluded to this before, it's not like these are banditos someplace on the outskirts of wherever shipping this stuff, these precursors to Mexico. These are the biggest companies in the country that have power in the party, and everyone there knows they're shipping to Mexico and they're killing Americans. Everyone knows it, and every time I read it, of course, I think of Mike's great book and the whole Opium War and all that. They see specifically that in their mind as payback for the Opium War, which Mike wrote so eloquently about. So for me, what does it mean? First of all, you need a transition. Secondly, you need tariffs on everything coming in from China. you would have the ability, maybe 35 or 40%. You would have the ability to adjust those so that you stay at balance. So now we're selling them 150, they're selling us 150. That's the first element. It has to be balanced. Number two, you have to stop the integration of our technology, not just in military and joint use, but across the board. There's no reason for us to be integrated in technology with China. They are stealing that technology from us. And then the third thing is these big investment banks shipping hundreds of billions of dollars over there to build up their military industrial complex. This is a fundamental fact. There is no truly private sector in China. There isn't any. If you're shipping money to invest in China, you are shipping money to help the state, period, full stop. I talk about state-owned enterprises, yes. And every other enterprise is a state-controlled enterprise, and that means any U.S. company doing business there. All of them. The money's going to the state. And then the second thing, their money coming here. Why are we letting them invest in things that have technology and data? The thing they pay the premium on is data. So you'll say, why are they buying this or that little insurance company? They want your data. Then they put it into their artificial intelligence. That's what this is all about. It is madness to think once you cross the line and say, yes, I understand the threat. And I would say if you, at this stage, in this year, if you don't understand the threat, then you're in Peter's book. Right? Guarantee, 100%. If you talk to me and say, yeah, I don't think there's a threat, then this is the book. So once you realize that this is what is going on, why would you continue to do business with them? It doesn't. Would you have done it with the Soviet Union? Would you have done it with Nazi Germany in the 40s? Would you have done it with Japan? I mean, of course not. Of course, it's just common sense. And who's going to object? A lot of people in New York, a lot of bankers, a lot of people on the West Coast. That's who's going to object. And importers, that's who's going to object. And what it means to me is they either don't understand the problem or they're really, really deficient in thought process.
Peter, your book's getting some wicked good plugs today. I want to ask you about your book, because some of the reasons that there's resistance to this extremely common sense, this common sense ideology or plan that the ambassador has laid out is because we have politicians' families who are corrupted by Chinese money. We have universities that are corrupted by Chinese money. We have academic fields, STEM specifically, that are infiltrated by Chinese nationals who, even if they aren't officially part of the military or the intelligence apparatus, they are beholden to it because their families are still in China. Hollywood is beholden to Chinese interests as well. We've seen that ratchet up increasingly in the last few years. From a legal standpoint, would legal action, meaning would legislation at the federal level make this swamp that we are sitting in here in Washington, D.C. more likely to embrace the strategic decoupling? And if so, what laws would it take?
It's a great question, Liz. I mean, the problem is Washington, D.C., Silicon Valley, Wall Street have a lot of very smart, clever people. And when you create a law, you create a barrier. It's like water going downhill. They figure out a way usually around it. But just think of a basic reform that I think everybody should agree on. Think about the first family of the United States. Joe Biden is required every year to disclose if he has $1,000 in General Electric stock. He's required to disclose, any other income or assets that he's received. He is required to disclose campaign donations, $200 or more. But his adult son engages in a series of deals with Chinese state-owned companies. And the calculation is, and it's based on the email laptop, it's $31 million. That he's received $31 million from 4 businessmen that are named in the laptop. And I do this in the book. You look at who those 4 men are, you go through Hong Kong corporate records, you see who their business partners are. The 4 businessmen that arranged those deals for Hunter Biden, based on his own words, all have business relationships at the highest levels of Chinese intelligence. Now, Ambassador Lighthizer said, we would never do this, with Nazi Germany, with the Soviet Union. Imagine if in the 1980s, Jimmy Carter's family or Ronald Reagan's family got some $31 million from Russian businessmen linked to the KGB. People would be apoplectic. But that's exactly what's happened with Biden. So, the reason I'm bringing this up, it's a disclosure question. My feeling is if anybody in elected office or in the bureaucracy at a senior level, if their immediate family members are engaged in commerce with foreign state-owned companies, they should be required to disclose it specifically and explicitly. I don't see how anybody could oppose that. And the fact that we know that Joe Biden owns GE stock for $1,200, but we don't know that his son is doing deals with, Chinese government entities is an example of the kind of gap that we have in our disclosure requirements.
Michael, people can feel hopeless when we talk about the enormity of what the Chinese Communist Party has leveraged and continues to leverage against the United States in all aspects of our life. Can we win?
Yes, and I can tell you some good news from the Heritage Foundation. I don't know if Kevin Roberts is here or Derek is here, but we all owe a round of applause to their coming to Heritage and reversing its approach to China. Heritage used to be one of the cheerleaders. And one of the orders Kevin Roberts gave, he wanted a compilation of all the good recommendations to deal with China, 1 page each. The problem, the solution, how to implement it. And all parts of Heritage contributed. Part of it is what Ambassador Lighthizer says, how to get our own fiscal house in order, our trade policy. But another 50 recommendations have to do with legislation congressmen like Chip Roy have already introduced, like farmlands, but it gets no co-sponsors. So the idea is, this is not going to keep you up at night reading, because it's like a recipe or a handbook for what are the 100 most important things we need to do, that over the next 3 or 4 years, we will now have the Liz Wheeler show, for example, able to comment. Okay, 14 have been done, 85 have not. This is a revolutionary thing. And no other think tank has done this. Our idea, and again, Kevin Roberts, he had the idea, how do we know how we're doing in the competition with China? How do we measure the indicators? Well, there's different anecdotal stories. China has more beer drinking than we do, but they're also ahead of us in supercomputers and hypersonic drones. So Heritage is going to be introducing an index of strategic competition between the US and China, which in part, we've already done a lot of it, it's quite scary. They're ahead of us in far more areas than I had realized. It's partly because of what Ambassador Lighthizer said. We've been open to sharing our technology and our scientific discoveries. The National Science Foundation has been one of the best friends of China for 40 years. Every new scientific discovery the National Science Foundation makes must be transferred quickly to China. We have a staff in our embassy in Beijing, which, as Bob knows, is our largest embassy in the world, 2,300 people. 50 federal agencies are in our embassy in Beijing, all of them helping China in one way or another. So this is what Heritage is starting to do in an optimistic way, so that Chip Roy sees, aha, this legislation hasn't even been drafted yet. And so he and his staff drafted. This goes back to the way Heritage began 50 years ago. I actually was around 50 years ago and saw the original Heritage office, what they did. From the beginning, they hired 3 young 25-year-old Senate and House staffers. And they got involved in legislation legally very early on in the process. And that's been the secret for Heritage for 50 years. Get involved with Congress, help them suggest new things, hire staff. We just hired a staff person for China from the House Foreign Affairs Committee who'll be drafting some of this new legislation. So I'm trying to be optimistic. There may not be a nuclear war in which we all die. It may just be a small one. and it can be negotiated. So, but I am looking over at Chip Roy. Is this correct? Is Heritage helping Congress by taking this approach?
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more about, I mean, I got to be honest and upfront. I'm biased. Kevin Roberts is a friend. We worked together at the Texas Public Policy Foundation before he came to Heritage, but Derek Morgan I've known for 22 years or something like that, and we worked together on Capitol Hill. They're doing a phenomenal job. I think Heritage is on offense in a way that maybe it hadn't been for a while. And in this issue in particular, they're helping enormously. My good friend Victoria Coates is brought on board at Heritage and is doing a phenomenal job on national security. She and I wrote a joint op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we do have legislation that needs to be advanced. We now have this committee on China. My friend Mike Gallagher is chairing that, and they're doing some good things. You alluded to the legislation that we introduced in my office to ban the ownership of land in the United States by the Chinese Communist Party and affiliates. I don't know why on earth we allow that to happen. It's like, yeah, so the Nazi Germany in 1940 come roll over here and buy up American farmland. It's absurd. But we hedge on it. We have this sort of, I think, over-expanded notion of how we view, in terms of free trade and people being able to come over and buy land and, hold on a second. We are a country, right? I mean, at some point here, it's like, well, do you want your aircraft carriers built in Beijing? I mean, or do you want to make sure we have that capacity here in the United States? Do you want to have farmland where you can grow goods, and feed your population without being overly reliant on the world? Trade's good. I'm for trade. But we got to make sure that our country is strong and that our lands are strong, our small businesses are strong. We got to stop this corporate cronyism subsidy that we've got going on, which brings in China as well, and make sure that the backbone of this country and small businesses is secure. But I'm ranting now beyond one question that the moderator didn't even ask me. So.
No, my question actually, and we're going to open it up to question and answer here in just a second, but my last question for you is, you're a member of the United States Congress, you have access to a lot of classified information about what China's going to do next. What can you tell us?
So, the answer to that question. Although I'll tell you, sometimes a lot of that stuff gets stovepiped. It's one of the problems that we're trying to crack through a little bit. A little bit of what the speaker's fight was about in January is kind of re-democratizing the House as a whole. It's like, you're on armed services and you're on foreign relations, so you're special and you get to know everything. Well, you know what? I represent 750,000 Texans, and I need to know the information that I need to know to represent them. So we're trying to do that. There's a lot more work to do to make the House be the House again. It's not just a handful of leadership positions and a handful of committee chairmen who make all the decisions. We make the decisions. The body makes the decisions, and I think we're making some progress on that. The only other thing that I'll mention, since I've got the floor and I'm filibustering, is energy. We haven't talked about energy here, and we've got, as a part of this debt ceiling fight that we're currently engaged in, and I hope Republicans will fire something off to the Senate next week. I think the framework is good. We're not here to talk about that, but a part of that is H.R. 1 to restore some more American energy and to get the permitting streamlined, but also to repeal most or all of the ridiculous so-called Inflation Reduction Act subsidies last August, which put us on a perilous path to not having strong American energy and make us reliant on China. While China is building, 2 new coal-fired plants a week, while they have 1,100 coal-fired plants in operation, we have 250, and we're building none. In the state of Texas, our grid is going to be 50% wind and solar by the end of next year. 50% wind and solar, and of 790 projects we currently have in the pipeline, 780 of them are wind and solar. Like 10 to 15 are gas-related projects. Think about that. Texas. We have a lot to do to get our country on the right path and stop being beholden to the radical leftist climate fetish agenda and get back on stride to be strong as America.
Amen. Amen to that. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question of any panelist, come right up to the microphone, introduce yourself, and direct your question to the specific panelist whose answer you want to hear.
They're all raising
Oh, I'm
up.
sorry. The microphone is in the back. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and let them. There's a couple of people with microphone. Oh, back here?
Yeah, I have a question about our ability to even analyze what China's doing, because I'm a Texan too. Served at Laughlin Air Force Base for a while, and we've got 200 square miles right next to that base owned by a CCP general. And if it wasn't for Kyle Bass, I'm not sure anyone would have been doing anything about it. So when you look at CFIUS and how the government even analyzes what China owns here, I feel like we're at whack-a-mole level. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if that's some of these guys are going to be more expert, I think, on some of that. I mean, I'll just say one thing. If you don't know Kyle Bass, if you don't follow him on social media, do. He's exposing a whole lot of the stuff going on with China, so follow Kyle.
Ambassador,
you want to take a question?
Well, I mean, the reality is we don't have a clue, right? I mean, that's you know, I sat on the CFIUS, which is the board that looks at inbound investment, and I can tell you every single time, I can't talk about things classified, but every single time anything came up with China, I said, we got two options. We either don't let them do it or we go to the president and let the president decide. I'm not having bureaucrats in the Department of Treasury say, well, this is okay, or we can mitigate it somehow. The reality is we really don't know. And most of you are sitting there thinking, well, but somebody in the government knows. And the reality is nobody in the government knows. We need a whole new approach to this thing. And most of what comes out really doesn't come out of the intelligence community in any event, who I have found, you know, during my time, both I was in the Reagan administration before Trump, I found him on these kinds of issues to be sadly lacking. So we are in trouble. And I have a sense that they know a hell of a lot more about what our people are doing there than we know about what their people are doing here.
You can all go on Amazon and pre-order Ambassador Lighthizer's new book, There Is No Free Trade. I've done so. How many are you willing to do that? He talks in the book about how to reorient the US government to really take China seriously.
Well,
he gets royalties for that.
Thank you, Michael.
And I would say God bless Kyle Bass. He has exposed a lot of nefarious things the Chinese are up to. What Ambassador Lighthizer is referring to, I think, is a recent GAO study that there is no law and no requirement to report Chinese purchases of American farmland, no matter how close it is to Lackland Air Force Base or anywhere else. We simply don't do that.
Right.
And the Farm Service Agency has now said it does not have the people to do it. So yes, Chinese buying farmland is a big deal.
Yeah.
Our government does not know what's going on.
Correct. And by the way, it's not just farmland, right? They own major food processing facilities. They own major, corporate entities that employ lots of Americans, and pharmaceutical interests that we ought to be moving back over here. I introduced legislation, the Beat China Act, to try to incentivize more of that. But we got to have a strategic plan to do it. Hopefully, this China committee with Mike Gallagher and some others will kickstart some of that.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from each of you your guesstimate or your feeling. How soon will China militarily invade Taiwan?
Michael, start with you.
China may not invade Taiwan. They are looking for signals for whether the deal they made with Henry Kissinger still is in effect. And almost nobody knows about this deal. It goes under the term One China policy. China says Taiwan belongs to them. You would think our policy would be, no, Taiwan does not belong to you. That is, in fact, our secret policy. That's what the lawyers say in the State Department. But the Kissinger deal, which every president has continued, although Trump challenged it, the deal has been, we will not object. We will acknowledge that you say Taiwan's part of China. There's now the idea that why don't we deter an invasion of Taiwan by having U.S. troops or munitions on Taiwan, or exercises with them, or training. We don't do any of that because under this deal, we won't have any formal contact with Taiwan. We will not call them a country. We will not say their name. And there was an effort to fix this just in December. In the National Defense Authorization Act, language was put in, bipartisan, actually came from Senator Menendez over on the Senate side. Let's call Taiwan by its proper name. It was mysteriously removed in the conference, along with every other important provision about the defense of Taiwan. So if you're in Beijing and you're thinking of invading, Right now, you're a little bit confused. Taiwan looks like a sitting duck, but there are some people in Congress who want to help Taiwan. Will they be successful? Will the candidate who is pro-China win the election in January in Taiwan? These are the things Xi Jinping is thinking about. So my view is we need to take it very, very carefully. The issue of deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And I'm not confident that we understand enough about the indicators that Xi Jinping and his military are using, because they're certainly thinking about it, and these exercises are getting more and more intense, coming closer, more jet fighters. I don't think Congressman Roy was on the trip, but you probably heard Mike McCall talk about how while he was in Taiwan, 71 jet fighters were sort of coming toward him, along with the 15 ships. And Maria Bartiromo you could see she was moved. Wow, maybe they are serious about attacking Taiwan, but can we deter them without understanding their own way of thinking, their own calculations? I'm not confident.
Peter, do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would just echo what Michael was saying. I think the January election of next year in Taiwan is critical. I think Beijing's going to do all sorts of things to try to get the pro-Beijing party to win that election, and they may be successful.
Ambassador?
So just briefly, I think it is 100% that Xi Jinping, in his mind, expects to have Taiwan when he's done. 100%. The question is, he views that as part of his legacy, part of his destiny. So I think it's 100%. The question is timing. What does it cost versus what doesn't it cost? Can it happen without force? I'm sure his preference would be for sure that it would happen without force. But if the question is, will he leave and not have that happen, I think there is zero chance in his mind of that. The other thing is just one China policy and the Kissinger Doctrine I got a kick out of, because when I was negotiating with the Chinese in the Trump administration, they would try this idea of strategic ambiguity on me, and I would come back and say, I don't want any ambiguity, strategic or otherwise. There's no ambiguity about Lighthizer. It just is or it isn't.
Good.
I can confirm this from preparing for the panel together, just so you guys know. Congressman, what's your take?
Look, I would just say this. I think this goes back to what I started with. We need to be on offense and we need to be acting now. And I say that because, and it's related to the question, if you're going to be at a place of wanting to decouple, if there's any rattling towards Taiwan, that's a good place for us to be able to push back on China, but we have to be ready to do it. And we've got to make sure that we're in a position to do it. And we've got to get more manufacturing capacity here, not be too reliant on China. We need to open up the Western Hemisphere. We need to stop allowing them to basically own the Western Hemisphere, right? South America, now their number one trading partner is China. It's not us, it's China. It's grown 26-fold since 2020, the trade between South America and China. Why are we allowing that to happen? We should have a robust, full trading economic engine going on in the Western Hemisphere, competing with China, pushing back on China. We should be obviously making our military stronger, but we need to be in a place to be able to push back on China the right way and be able to avoid hot war and conflict by using our economic might and engine to do it. And we're on our heels with $32 trillion of debt, with China engaged in offense, and we're all just sitting back twiddling our thumbs. The best way to prevent them going into Taiwan or be in a position to have a strong response to it is if we're on offense economically, in my view.
All right, we're just about out of time, but I want to take one last question from the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Brendan Steinhauser, all the way from Austin, Texas. Unfortunately, I live just outside of Congressman Roy's district. Drive by it every day.
There's time to move.
Yeah. Good pitch. I'm with Young Americans for Liberty, and one of the questions I have in my mind is, we talked about TikTok. What should American policy be as it relates to American companies like Google, Facebook, but also companies like 23andMe who are doing a lot of data collection? What should American policy be as it relates to, those companies working with the CCP to sell shared data, things that could lead to a potential, surveillance state issue on Americans? Thank you.
Ambassador.
I mean, to me, it's the implementation may be slightly more complicated, but to me, I wouldn't allow it. I think it's outrageous. Nothing like that happens unless they may have made a calculation that it's net in their interest more than it is in our interest. So I don't think our technology should be growing together. I think it should be growing apart. And we ought to be growing together with Europe and Japan and our allies. So to me, I would not permit it. I don't understand the argument for it. And I've had senior people, I won't tell you their names, but senior business people when I was in the government who came in and said, our smartest people are in Beijing. I'm not, if I told you one of the names, trust me, you know the name. And my kind of reaction was, well, shame on you, right? I mean, don't you get it? What do you think this whole thing is just about you getting another couple of billion to add to your 30 now? What's going on in your head? I don't think, and I think there's an awful lot to that. You look at the apps that are coming out, they're all coming out. They're leading in all these apps. They have all that kind of technology over there in Beijing, and we ought to not allow any of it. We ought to force that technology back into the United States. And what is the cost of not having things like TikTok? I mean, there is literally zero cost to these things, right? I mean, it isn't like we're giving up food or something. We're giving up something we don't need in the first damn place. So for me, I would not permit that kind of technological integration as part of my strategic decoupling. And I hope that Congress finds their way there. And I also believe this to be true. I think if you and I would like to get the congressman to tell me yes or no. Actually, I wanted to say yes, not yes or no. But some of these things that everyone in here in this room would agree, every single one, if you had a vote in the House on that item, it would pass with a vast majority of our people and a substantial majority of the other, right? I mean, I just think like this simple kinds of things, if you just ran one vote after another, now the Senate's going to be the Senate, okay, fine, but at least you would be on record that we can't allow these things to happen, and that we can do this kind of decoupling. So, I mean, what's your answer? Would these things pass? Am I wrong? Is it?
No, I mean, a little bit what I said earlier, that you've got, to some degree, you've got this kind of conflict in the general conservative / Republican mind. I don't say they're one and the same. That's why it's conservative / Republican mind about they're so beholden to market thinking that they go, oh, well, but that exists. We can't interfere with, Google or Apple or whatever. And so, and for me, for the record, I see a little bit more of a kind of a sliding scale from the standpoint of social media companies. You made it even like the value add, right? Like, I don't give a rip that TikTok exists. It would be better if it didn't, right? In my view, I feel that way about a whole lot of social media. You've got some, things like Apple that are producing products and things that we use, and you've got obviously Google that provides services that are both some helpful and some that are less so. My point of bringing that up is there's two issues at play. China and what they're doing in China, I think we ought to take a hard line on that. You've also got size and scope of these companies. You get into whole sorts of questions of antitrust issues. But our guys get resistant when you're saying, guys, you don't understand what time it is. Like, this isn't just like, okay, what are we doing in some sort of economic sense? Your national security, your well-being is at stake. China is 100% embedded with all of these guys, and we need to go to war to change that mindset. I'm telling you, a good block of your general average Republican in the House and the Senate, they're not there in that way of thinking.
Well, can I ask you, do me a favor, when you find an actual conservative Republican who thinks that market principles are more important than American families and communities, if you would just call me, I'd love to have a meeting with the person, because I've got to.
You use the term actual conservative. That limited the pool pretty small.
All right, well, that's, yeah. So let me just say a Republican, even one who claims to be a conservative, these are not similar scope problems. China versus, on balance, I like market. No, if you like market, you're gone. Right? I mean, the market is what got us to the point that we have this $1 trillion deficit and that we're shipping that money. That's called the market. There was a great quote, if I can remember it, by a French prime minister, and he said, what is the market but human nature? And what is civilization but a fight against human nature. And I thought, that kind of summarizes it. Don't tell me the market. The market is, I mean, that's not, we're civilized because we fight those kind of tendencies. And this is an exact example of one. So I know those people exist, and I'd love to talk to them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Lighthizer, Congressman Chip Roy, Peter Schweizer, and Michael Pillsbury.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.